So if you are on our email list, you got an email this week that I shared that Bob Long, who is a member of Restoration, unexpectedly passed away this week. And Bob was one of the founders of Restoration. I mean, Bob was the guy who drove me and Marianne and somebody else around from place to place looking at spaces before we ever launched. Right? He was driving us around and helped physically get into the spaces. So it was really unexpected this week when Bob passed away. And Bob and I had spent a lot of time talking about the church, and something that I think that's really important for you to know is Bob loved his church. He loved telling people about his church. When I met with his family, that was one of the first things they said was how much he loved Restoration and how important it was to him. Now, Bob deeply loved the church, but there was one other thing that Bob really, really loved. And if you went to the University of Virginia, you know this. Bob loved the University of Virginia. I loved that Bob loved the University of Virginia. And he loved this last season of basketball, especially, NCAA tournament win, right? It was a big, big year. And just a few weeks ago, Bob was coming in, and we were talking about Tony Bennett, who's the coach of UVA basketball. And Tony's really the real deal, by the way. He's really a great guy. And we were having this conversation about this article that had come out about Tony Bennett, because one of the things, just look at that face, right? One of the things I am always worried about with Tony, one of the things that Bob constantly was worried about with Tony was that he was going to leave UVA. What was one of the bigger schools that were going to scoop him up and take him? So UVA got pretty smart, and they started talking about his contract. Now, Tony has come out and he's talked about money before. He's been very public about money. And one of the things that he said that I want to share with you this morning is he says, I have more than I need. I am blessed beyond what I deserve. Right? I have more than I need. I am blessed beyond what I deserve. Tony Bennett, season 10 of being a coach at UVA. He gets the NCAA title, right? It's the first time ever in our school's history. He gets to the Final Four for the first time in 35 years, right? This is big, big stuff. So Carla Williams, who's the athletic director, gets pretty smart at UVA, right? She goes to President Ryan and says, hey, we got to give Tony more money, right? We've got to keep him here. So she sits down with Tony Bennett and she looks at his contract and she says, hey, we want to give you more money. We want to give you a lot more. And he says that he's going to talk to his wife, and he comes back and he says, I don't want any more money. He says, instead, I'd like for you to take what you were going to give me and give it to the rest of my coaches and pour into the basketball team. So instead of me giving more, I would like for you to take instead of me getting more, I'd like for you to take what I was going to get and give it. But this is his actual quote I wanted to share with you. He said, Laurel and I are in a great spot. That's his wife. And in the past, I've had increases in my contract, Bennett said. We just feel a great peace about where we're at, all that's taken place, and how we feel about this athletic department and the community and this school. I have more than enough. And if there are ways that this can help out the athletic department, the other programs and coaches, then that's my desire. Y'all think about that. Somebody came and offers this guy a big raise. Now, it's not the end of the story. Then he and Laurel pledged $500,000 of their own money to the university to start a program for basketball players who either are previous players or current players to get them into jobs, to help them in job placement. So after they don't take a raise, he then gives $500,000 to the university. Now, I admit that I'm a little biased, but that's generous. That is the picture of generosity right there. And what I say about Tony Bennett, look, we've had lots of coaches at UVA basketball. We've had lots of coaches at football. I've seen lots of coaches in the past. Bennett is very open about his Christian faith. And he is not a guy that just talks about it. He's a guy that lives it. Last week I talked about this concept of we could just talk about our faith, or we can actually live out compassion and mercy and grace. Tony Bennett's a guy that lives it out. He walks the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk. And for him, this idea of generosity is a really, really important piece of the puzzle for his faith. To give back. He doesn't need more and more and more. He wants to be generous with others. So in the last 3 weeks, we've been in this sermon series, Small Steps, Giant Leaps. And it's the 50th anniversary of the first steps on the moon. And we've been using that theme to help us walk through this idea of our own journey in our spiritual life. And how do we take small steps? How do we take incremental changes that lead to big, big things? What do we do where we step out? Last week we talked about how do we serve in a way that actually changes people's lives? How do we use compassion? And how do we live and become people who are more living out the gospel of Jesus Christ? The week before we talked about discipleship and how do we move along our spiritual journey. The first week it was worship. And this week we're going to talk about this concept of generosity. How do we take steps in our life with generosity that will actually lead to greater steps in our faith? I think in this sermon today I want to begin somewhere, and it's really beautiful that before Matt and the team saw my sermon this morning, they had picked out songs. Because the place that we have to start is with how generous God is to us. Right? And we sang this morning, this last song, "Great is your faithfulness," right? God, where you meet us in the midst of where we are and how you bless us and how generous you are to us. And I think in order for us to become more generous people, we have to come to believe that God is deeply generous with us. That God is a generous God who loves us and journeys with us and meets us in the middle of our own story. But it's not simply that God is generous with us. That's not the only reason we give and we're generous. I don't know if you know it, but there are studies that have been done that show generosity actually changes our physical and our mental health. Do you know that? The more generous you are, the better you feel. Not only does it reduce stress, it supports one's physical health, it enhances one's sense of purpose, naturally fights depression, but it's also shown to increase one's lifespan. The more generous you are, the longer you live. Tell that to your financial planner. See how that works out in your discussion, right? I'm going to live longer, so I'm going to give more. The more generous you are, the longer you live. Studies show that the more generous of a human you are, it has literally physical and emotional effects on your life. I want to take a look this morning at the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verses 6 to 11, through the lens of this concept of generosity. Paul says this, "What I mean is this, the one who sows a small number of seeds will also reap a small crop. The one who sows a generous amount of seeds will also reap a generous crop. Everyone should give whatever they've decided in their heart. They shouldn't give with hesitation or because of pressure. God loves a cheerful giver." God has the power to provide you with more than enough of every kind of grace. That way you'll have everything you need, always and in everything, to provide more than enough for every kind of good work. As it is written, He scattered everywhere. He gave to the needy. His righteousness remains forever. The one who supplies seed for planting and bread for eating will supply and multiply your seed, will increase your crop, which is righteousness. You'll be made rich in every way so that you can be generous in every way. Such generosity produces thanksgiving to God through us. All right, so this is the early church trying to figure out how to live in community together. This is a letter written about unity, like come together, be together as a community. And Paul says, you reap what you sow, right? That's a phrase you've heard before, right? You reap what you sow. So plant a lot. Paul's talking about generosity, and generosity is really important, friends. Your financial generosity, I talk about this all the time, is the reason that we can do things like feed kids who are hungry in this school. It's the reason that we can provide for single moms and provide meals at South Lakes High School. It's the reason that we can do events like Trunk or Treat or Poor Theology out in our community to try to reach our community. It's the reason that we have a program for our kids right now, and we have a program on Wednesday evening for our students. It's the reason that we have this incredible music. It's the reason that we have live stream, and people can actually worship without being here. And the reasons go on and on and on. Your generosity makes a huge difference in people's lives, and they might be lives of people that you never see. Lives of people that you may never know. But friends, know that your generosity helps people who don't have homes, helps people who are hungry have food, helps people who are depressed have counseling. Your generosity makes a difference. No matter where I turn in our mission, I see our generosity. And when I look at it through the lens of what Paul is saying in this text today, I think he gives us some framework around generosity. And you might be surprised because Paul is sometimes a little harsh in his words. But I don't think in his words this morning he's harsh. The first thing Paul gives us in verse 6 is this guideline around financial giving. He says, what I mean is this: the one who sows a small number of seeds will also reap a small crop. The one who sows a generous amount of seeds will also reap a generous crop. It's amazing to me, friends, how generous you are. The more generous you are, the more life and love you seem to have. It's an incredible thing. It may not make sense by our worldly standards, but it's an incredible thing. When we allow our giving to impact our financial decisions, like what you put on an estimate of giving card, which you see in your seat, the difference in giving 1% of your giving versus 10% of your giving, the difference in saying, I'm going to give the leftover versus I'm going to plan for it, that actually deals with our spiritual life. It leads to our spiritual growth. It leads to steps in our life. And that's what Paul seems to be getting to. Because ultimately, spiritual practice should lead to transformation, right? It should lead to change. The studies show it. Right? The studies tell us that the more generous you are, the more it physically changes in your life. Paul seems to be saying the same thing. Now, this is what's so clear about what Paul says here. Paul tells us that if we sow sparingly, we'll reap sparingly. Now, here's the problem. Some people read this passage, TV preachers, right? TV preachers who have their own airplanes, right? They read this passage and they say, church, if you're more generous, God is going to bless you with more money. God is going to bless you with more great gifts and things that show up at your Amazon, right? It's going to deliver more to your house by accident. But that's not what the passage says. What the passage says is when you sow more, more is going to grow. More is going to come up out of the ground. God is going to bless you, but not with riches and more money. God's going to bless you because that is the very nature of God, to bless you. Because when we sow more, our spiritual life is more open, and we are more open to God and to God's generosity that already exists in our life. Some of you may have watched the U.S. Open tournament that just happened. And you may have seen at the end of the U.S. Open tournament when Naomi Osaka beats Coco. Is her last name Gauss? Is that how you say Gauss? Gauss? Okay, Gauss. When she beats her, there's this really, really emotional moment. I mean, Coco's really, really upset, right? And Naomi comes over to her and she does this. In the midst of the whole thing, she gives her a big hug. I mean, she has just defeated her. And she comes over and she gives her a big hug. It really inspired people. The interwebs went crazy over this moment. And Osaka said this. I want to put it up on the screen because I want you to see it. It was kind of instinctive because when I shook her hand, I saw that she was kind of tearing up a little. And it reminded me how young she was. For me, I just thought about what I wanted her to feel leaving the court. I wanted her to have her head held high, not walk off the court sad. I want her to be aware that she's accomplished so much and she's still so young. Isn't that a beautiful moment? It's a beautiful thing for her to do. Now, where did that come from? Actually, it came from the year before. The year before, Osaka beats Serena Williams. But it was a big contested deal. Right? There were all of these things where there were bad calls that were made, and it was big contested. And Osaka's joy was sort of drawn out of it. And Serena Williams came over and gave her a hug. She gave her this beautiful gift. So now Goff is blessed by what Williams did last year. There's this generosity and this empathy that was sowed, that was given to her, that was shared generously with her. Now, I'm not calling you to go hug everybody in the world unless you want to, Please ask permission first. That's a helpful thing. But what I'm saying is, friends, when we sow more, we reap more. When we give more, it happens. So Paul's guideline seems to be this thing of like, realize what you sow, you're going to reap. Do it. Here's the second thing. He gives this guardrail for giving, and I love this. He says, everyone should give whatever they've decided in their own heart. They shouldn't give with hesitation or because of pressure. God loves a cheerful giver. Say that to your neighbor. God loves a cheerful giver. All right. What does Paul mean by this? Paul is saying you shouldn't be guilted. Don't do it because you feel guilty. I know people who get those things in the mail and they give $10 to everybody. They do it because the puppy's face looks so sad, right? You should never be guilted into giving. I mean, we should give. I think that's a spiritual practice, and it's something that we do because it increases our growth. But the other side, Paul says, is that we should give cheerfully, not out of guilt, not out of pressure, but give cheerfully. Now, cheerful giving, friends, is not contingent on your financial income. It's dependent on what's coming out of you. It's dependent on your spiritual life. It's dependent on, I want to give this because I believe it's going to impact the world. I want to give this because when I give cheerfully, it makes a difference. There's a group of churches in the Indian state of Mizoram. And they have this phrase about giving, about generosity. And the phrase is Bufai Tam. And it means one handful of rice at a time. This process started back in 1914, where what the individual members of the churches would do is before dinner each night, they would take a handful of rice out of their rice, and they would set it aside. And then they would make their dinner. And each church member on Sunday would bring their handful of rice to the church, and the church would sell their rice. And back in 1914, they were making like $150 a year. They have kept this practice going on. And today, they raise about $1.5 billion a year in rice in this community, in this group of churches where people bring their rice to the church. They support like 1,800 missionaries. They support their community and the needs of the people in their community. They take care of the folks. One of the members of the church said, it's not our richness or our poverty that makes us serve the Lord, but our willingness. So we Mizo people say, as long as we have something to eat every day, we have something to give God every day. Isn't that a perspective? As long as we have something to eat every day, we have something to give God every day. The question is, when you give, do you give cheerfully? That seems to be Paul's guardrail. Give generously, but give cheerfully. That's important. And finally, he talks about the goal of giving. Verses 11 and 12, he says, you'll be made rich in every way so that you can be generous in every way. Such generosity produces thanksgiving to God through us. Your ministry of this service to God's people isn't only fully meeting their needs, but it's also multiplying in many expressions of thanksgiving to God. Paul says the goal of giving is to enrich you, to make your life richer. Again, he's not doing this prosperity gospel thing. He's not saying so that you'll get more money and so that you'll get more stuff and more things. The gift is to enrich your life, to transform your life, to realize that through your generosity, you're making a difference in other people's lives. It's a source of joy and the practice of thanksgiving back to God for God's generosity to you. I want you to be more generous with your giving. I don't want you to be more generous so it can meet our budget. That's important too, but that's not why I ask you to do it. I ask you to do it because I believe it'll transform your life. I believe when you're more generous, when I'm more generous, it transforms our lives. My wife and I have been giving to the church ever since we've been married, and that was her deal, not mine, where she came to me and said, oh, we're doing this. There's a lot of wisdom my wife has, a lot more than me on a lot of things, and this is one of those things. I would say our financial giving to our church has been one of the top 5 decisions that we've made in our life. And I won't tell you the other 4. You can figure that out. But being generous people is really, really important. So today, each week you've had a response. This week you have the card. I'm not actually going to ask you to fill this out in worship today. I'm going to ask you to bring it back next week. Or if you're worshiping with us online, they're online too under our Give section. But I'm going to ask you to think about what's the next step you want to take in your generosity. What's the step you want to take? And I would love it if every family in this church filled out a card. If your card says 0, it's okay. I'm not going to judge what's on your card, but I'm going to pray for you and pray for your generosity because I believe generosity transforms lives. What's your next faithful step? How will you become even more of a cheerful giver to your church? The idea for giving is that you take the next faithful step. Just know that my heart's desire for you is that you grow deeper in your spiritual life, that you are richly, richly blessed, and most importantly, that you see the blessings that God has for you, the ways that God loves you. I pray that we continue to be a community that makes a difference in our community. And friends, make no mistake, your generosity makes a huge difference in our community. So thank you.